And so, the global nuclear arms race began. To develop new nuclear weapons required extensive testing, and most of it was done in remote places like the Arctic or the South Pacific Islands. The U.S. also created a nuclear testing site in Nevada, the radioactive products of which blew across the country, so that outside of Japan, the people most adversely affected by American nuclear weapons were Americans themselves. The U.S. soon graduated from fission weapons to thermonuclear bombs, which combined fission and fusion to release even more energy. They were as big a leap from the first atomic bombs as those devices were from conventional explosives, 1,000 times again more powerful.
Annihilation of any life on Earth will involve within the range of limited possibility.
In 1954 at Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific, the U.S. tested a new thermonuclear design that used lithium deuteride as a fuel, and they expected the device, codenamed Shrimp, to release the energy equivalent of 6 million tons of TNT. But they were wrong. It released 2.5 times that due to unanticipated reactions with lithium-7. And as a result, more radioactive material was created, and it rained down over a much larger area than planned. Residents of neighboring atolls were only evacuated 3 days later, suffering from radiation sickness. And further east, the 23 crew of a Japanese fishing boat were caught in a flurry of radioactive white ash. And by that evening, they were suffering from acute radiation syndrome. One of the crew died from ensuing complications 6 months later. These events triggered public outcry against nuclear testing. The modern peace sign was designed in the 1950s by combining the semaphore letters for N and D, standing for nuclear disarmament. A number of world leaders called for a comprehensive test ban. No more testing of nuclear weapons by any state. And this call was actually taken seriously by the world's nuclear powers. They entered into negotiations at meetings with very literal names like the Conference on the Discontinuance of Nuclear Weapon Tests, held in Geneva in 1958. And to show just how serious they were, they even stopped all testing during the negotiations, which is why 1959 is the only year in a long stretch when no nuclear weapons were detonated. But there was a big problem with negotiating a comprehensive test ban, which is, how do you know that the other side will hold up their end of the bargain? The US worried that the Soviets would continue testing covertly and leapfrog them technologically, and the Soviets similarly distrusted the US. So to address these concerns, they convened the Conference of Experts to study the possibility of detecting violations of a possible agreement on suspension of nuclear tests. Seriously, that was the name. I am not making this up. Now, detecting atmospheric tests was fairly straightforward. The radioactive isotopes they produce disperse in the atmosphere and can be detected thousands of kilometers away. Underwater tests produce distinctive sounds that travel efficiently around a kilometer below the surface of the ocean, and these can be picked up by hydrophones. But underground tests are much harder to detect from afar because their radiation is mostly contained, and the Soviets refused to allow on-site compliance visits, which they regarded as espionage. And this is ultimately why when a test ban treaty was signed in 1963, it was only a partial ban. It banned testing underwater, in the atmosphere, and in space, places where compliance could be verified, but it didn't ban testing underground, for the simple reason that it was almost impossible to verify compliance. But scientists had been trying to find a way to reliably detect underground detonations. Following the Geneva meeting, American and Soviet scientists formed a working group to discuss the issue. And their idea was to use seismometers located outside the countries where nukes were being tested to detect the faint ground vibrations caused by explosions. The problem was, how do you distinguish a nuclear test from an earthquake? Every day around the world, there are close to 300 earthquakes with a magnitude of 3 or greater. In addition, part of the purpose of detecting your adversary's tests is to spy on them, to know how big of an explosion they can make. But the seismometer signal depends not only on the yield of the device, but also on how deep it was buried. For a given yield, deeper explosions appear smaller. So scientists wanted a method to reliably determine whether a given signal was a bomb or an earthquake, and if it was a bomb, how big it was and how deep it was buried. They knew that all this information was contained in the seismometer signal, but it couldn't just be read off by looking at the squiggles. They needed to know how much of different frequencies were present, which meant they needed to take a Fourier transform. A Fourier transform is a way of decomposing a signal into pure sine waves, each with its own amplitude and frequency that add to make it up. This seems a bit like magic, since the sum of a set of sine waves can look arbitrarily complicated and nothing like its component parts. There are some elegant ways to understand how Fourier transforms work. Shout out to the awesome video by 3Blue on Brown. But I want to take more of a brute force approach. If you want to know how much of a particular sine wave is in a signal, just multiply the signal by the sine wave at each point, then add up the area of the curve. As a simple example, say our signal is just a sine wave with a certain frequency, but pretend we don't know that. We're trying to figure out which sine waves add to make it up. Well, if you multiply this signal by a sine wave of an arbitrary frequency, the two waves are uncorrelated. You're just as likely to find places where they have the same sign, both positive or both negative, as where they have opposite signs. And therefore, when you multiply them together, the area above the x-axis is equal to the area below